On May 28, 2023, the west side of a six-story apartment building at 324 West Main Street in Davenport collapsed. Emergency workers first found a woman trapped in the rubble and had to amputate one of her legs to save her. Later, the bodies of 3 tenants were found. People throughout the Quad Cities reacted first with shock and awe. Then an anger grew as people from Moline and Rock Island and as far away as Galesburg showed up in Davenport to express their frustration. They questioned the city's system of rental inspections. They demanded to know why the building wasn't evacuated sooner, despite warnings of structural damage. The aftermath of the collapse of the Davenport brought many questions, and it was clear the tragedy laid bare voices of those who wanted to talk about poverty, wages, and the struggle to find housing. Some of the displaced tenants, as well as former residents of the building who vacated in the weeks and months before the west wall turned to dust, told me the reason they lived in the Davenport was because it was one of the few places that accepted people with felony convictions, bad credit scores, and evictions on their record. "It's just above the last rung on the ladder," a woman told me. "What's the last rung?" I asked. "The last rung? That would be the relax up on Brady. There's a few places like that," she said. "After that, it's the shelters or the streets." The last rung, I soon learned, was the extended stay hotels scattered throughout the Quad Cities that offered daily, weekly, and monthly rates affordable to those living on the margins. It was in those last rung rooms that I found people who told me stories of desperation and fear and addiction. They were stories, said a woman who called herself Amber, of the Quad Cities underworld. My name is Tom Lowy, and I'm a reporter for the Quad City Times. And this is the beginning of The Last Rung, 2 series devoted to underreported aspects of life and crime and survival in the Quad Cities, and how those aspects often intersect. In the first series, we look at overdoses in our metro area, what causes them, the role of addiction, and how drugs like fentanyl and synthetic opioids drive overdose deaths. Throughout this series, you will meet loved ones of those who died, a survivor, the first responders who try to prevent deaths, or coroner who sees the aftermath of fatal overdoses, a police chief whose family member died from an overdose, and visit a drug court that offers hope and redemption. In the second series, you'll meet women who describe their lives as sex workers and how addiction, poverty, and the threat of being unhoused led them to the illegal and extremely dangerous work of having sex with strangers. As a woman called Leanne Gott told me, when you can't risk stealing no more, you try selling the only thing you have left. Sex work is a last rung. The Sex Work series is based on interviews with 23 sex workers over a period of roughly 14 months. It was during those interviews that sex workers addicted to drugs like heroin and methamphetamine talked about friends and loved ones who died of overdoses. Later, a number of sex workers provided information about the January 15th double murder of Brian Goodwin and Amy Smith and how both were tied to using and selling drugs. Later still, a man from Chicago was arrested in Bettendorf and charged with human trafficking and pimping. We heard his name 7 months before that arrest, as a sex worker I interviewed tied him to Brian Goodwin and to pimping. What started with the collapse of the Davenport led to an extended stay hotel on North Brady Street. From there, we pulled on the threads: poverty, homelessness, sex work, addiction, overdoses, drug dealing, theft, murder, exploitation. I didn't do it alone. Reporters Anthony Watt and Thomas Geyer lent their considerable experience and expertise interviewing law enforcement officials, first responders, and burrowing deep into court records. Photographer Caitlin Metzger shot the photos and produced these recordings. This is what we saw and heard and witnessed.